Victory speech, overwhelming results in South Carolina. We called it right at the top of the hour as soon as the polls closed. Back with the team here in New York. Listen, you've heard a lot of Trump speeches?
Yeah, I mean, RIP the Reagan GOP. There's something so jarring about watching Lindsey Graham and Tim Scott, all of who condemned him after January 6th, lining up to do their best campaign rally impersonation and saying this is the most qualified man to be president.
The night of January 6th, Lindsey Graham was saying he was,
I'm done with him.
Enough.
I mean, listen, it is the greatest political comeback in history. Just 3 years ago, he was done in the party, and it only took a matter of months before he came back and handily won in Nikki Haley's home state. The question now becomes this. She's held on, we'll see where the margins break down tonight, to about just under a third of Republican votes in some of these primaries. How many of those votes will go to Donald Trump? Because he will need those in a general election. Some of those are never going to be with him, but how many is the open question now?
Okay, I mean, for me, Tim Scott is obviously auditioning to be vice president. And every time Trump just ritually humiliates him, talks about him having low energy, makes fun of his campaign, and then Tim Scott gets out there and he tries to do something that's really not natural to him, and then he walks off. But, we were talking about before, this is kind of the pathway that Pence got on. And so you might not just be watching the resurrection of a Tim Scott, but you might also be watching the rise of resurrection of Trump, the rise of Tim Scott.
I cannot think of a Republican that I want to be vice president more than Tim Scott.
Sure.
We love Tim Scott. Yeah. All Republicans of all stripes love Tim Scott. And I agree with what Donald Trump said. I think he's a good man.
Yes.
And I think he's a humble man. And I want him to do whatever he has to do to get this job. I really do, because I think
You're in luck.
I
think he is. He does seem willing. You should feel good.
Your will will be granted,
You all are down on what is going on here. But politics has become performative, and he is doing what he has to do. And if he is on this ticket, Republicans are going to love it. They're going to love it. So I'm glad to see him going all around.
Tim Scott is I firmly believe Tim Scott is a good man.
Yes.
I've said that many times before. My line about Tim Scott is that I would give Tim Scott a kidney if he asked me, but I'd never vote for him, right? But the person that Tim Scott has become while auditioning, you call it auditioning, I'd probably call it something else if I was just talking to Audie and Van and we were in a room by ourselves. But what he's doing right now is embarrassing. And I think this is not the Tim Scott that we know. But you also see this happen with many men and women who actually find themselves in this Trump orbit. I mean, this is not who Lindsey Graham, we knew Lindsey Graham to be before.
He wouldn't even show his face in Munich this time, after years and years going with John McCain to the conference that celebrates the NATO alliance. He wouldn't even show up.
And thank you. That bolsters the point that I'm making. And you're seeing a shell of who Tim Scott really is. He's not the rah-rah, this is Trump country, woo-ha, let's go do this. I mean, and at the end of the day, I mean, what does he get from this? I mean,
maybe the vice presidency.
Maybe, but if he misses, what is he, HUD director?
Or U.S. Senator from South Carolina and one of the most respected Republicans in the country.
But he's losing. But he's losing. No, not either way. My point, and I think Van's point and everybody else's point, is that you're losing respect day by day by going out here and auditioning.
There is a segment of lifelong Republicans who are mortified by what Tim Scott's doing. We are definitely the minority. You're absolutely right, Scott. But there are some of us who are like, we thought you were one of the good ones. We thought you were going to tell the truth. I want to know his answer to certifying the election question. That's fundamental.
Subjugation is the toll you have to pay when you enter Trump's world. You have to subjugate yourself. The whole party is subjugating itself to Donald Trump.
Yeah, which is why, I understand the point about making it it's embarrassing that there's a black guy doing this. A lot of white guys are doing it too, right? And on Alyssa's point, I agree with that. I know a lot of conservatives and Republicans who wince when they see some of, particularly the New Hampshire victory speech thing, where he came on and after Vivek Ramaswamy and really did not cover himself in glory. Where I disagree a little bit with Alyssa, and where I think it's sort of significant here that Nikki Haley stays in, is I really think the future of American politics is going to be the future of factions. And I miss the days, we were better off when the Democratic Party had really strong and robust competing factions where they had to negotiate with each other. Republican Party desperately needs that. What Nikki Haley staying in the race does, I mean, there are a lot of things it does, but one of the things it does is it solidifies and gives permission structure for a big chunk of the Republican Party to be a non-Trump faction. And since Trump is not going to appoint a single person in his second administration to be a check on him, not one, who could successfully do it. There are going to be no Barrs and Kellys or any of that kind of people. The only way to hold him in check is to have a constituency in the Republican Party that will punish senators and congressmen who don't push back on some of the crazy.
Can I ask a question, though? But can she actually do that, or is she the leader or creator of this mold that's a faction? If, for example, tonight, to David's point, she doesn't even do well in the 1st Congressional District, which is the most moderate, which is it's Charleston, it's Berkeley, it's Dorchester, it's where you would think somebody like Nikki Haley can do well. If she gets bludgeoned there, and then disregard the rest of the state, can she be the leader of this?
Yes, sir. My only point, pushing back on what Alyssa said when she said RIP to the Reagan GOP, my point is it's sort of like Miracle Max. It's only mostly dead. And the way you build it back is by building up a faction like this.
Can I get a couple of points? I want to ask you a question, but the language is so funny because you could say the same words and they can mean something completely different. Nikki Haley says, "I'm not going anywhere." And the Trump folks are saying, "You're not going anywhere." They're saying the same thing, but it's really, really different. My question to you is if she says in the near term, yes, when I raised my hand and said that I would vote for Trump even if he were convicted, can she be the leader of that faction? Do you have to pay that toll in order to be the leader of the faction?
I think it'll be really hard. And I should say, full disclosure, my wife used to work for Nikki Haley. I know Nikki Haley. I have no connection to her now. I think it would be really hard. It'd be really hard to say the things that she's been saying and then endorse them. But at the same time, like in 1976, Reagan ran, he didn't win, and he created a faction. That's the history of the GOP. Is the team.
What do you think she says? What does she say
tonight?
Their
term next time.
What does Nikki Haley come out and say tonight?
I don't know. This sounds like fan fiction to me. I'm sorry. I just two things. One, I don't think there's anyone who is supportive of Trump right now that doesn't want to be there. I don't think that Tim Scott feels he's subjugating himself any more than Elise Stefanik does at CPAC right now. The era where there were people who kind of went along to get along to be in office is over. If you are on stage with Trump right now, I do think you are along because you want to be there. And Tim Scott has been performing a necessary action for Trump, who is always trying to show, I'm not that racist, right? That's like always the argument. And he represents that, just like Vivek Ramaswamy did. The other thing is we're looking at South Carolina like it's the same South Carolina from a year ago, even though it's had explosive growth from both red and blue states. Yeah. But Republicans from those states, which means the people who are going there are not the people who knew her before. And if anything, they're probably Trump supporters from other states. It's part of our cultural self-sorting. I don't think the rump state you're talking about of Republicans is just going to rise up this election. It sounds like it's a years-long project.
Yeah, it is.
And I don't think...
I'm not talking about anything for 2024. I'm talking about the future of the Republican Party.
Well, and Anderson, you asked like what Nikki Haley has to do tonight. I have to say, I'm hearing from my Republican sources who are basically saying, look, she now is potentially going to pay a price for staying in to her own political future, whatever that may be, especially if this is...
But didn't you hear people saying, we still like her, it's just not her time? I didn't hear people saying she's excommunicated.
If she stays in and continues to run against Trump, I think that there is going to be... I'm just picking up this sense that there are going to be more people...
Trump did himself harm in New Hampshire when he stood up and behaved as badly as he did in a moment of triumph, just, acting like a jerk. And I think he tried to avoid that tonight. I wouldn't mistake that for the idea that they'll all be cool if she hangs around too long.
I mean, she's now running to be president of I Told You So. I mean, the faction you're talking about is predicated on Trump winning the nomination, losing the presidency, and then she gives a speech and says, I told you. That's the fact.
I'm an I told you so
but
guy. I've been playing myself for 6 years.
Alyssa, then we're going to go back.
There is a reality where we could have a conviction of Donald Trump come down late summer, and I think Nikki Haley wants to stay in the race to be the person who's been raising money, raising her name ID, talking to both sides of the party, and the person who's pulling the best head-to-head against Donald Trump.
It is insane to think that the party is going to turn
I acknowledge
to Nikki
that.
Haley
That is the strategy that does not work. The RNC will turn their back on her in a heartbeat because she challenged Donald Trump.
And all these delegates are going to be Trump delegates, too. I mean, this idea that you can go to the convention and say, like, oh, look, I have these delegates in my corner, and I've also managed to anger all of the other delegates in the room. The math just doesn't work.
I think one of the things we're doing for Nikki is we're actually lowering the bar as we go around because she just got pummeled in her home state. And I understand about the explosive growth in South Carolina. That is true, particularly in the Low Country and around the York County area. But the fact remains that the fundamentals of South Carolina are still the same. I mean, when you look at the upstate, I mean, it still is uber Christian conservative evangelicals. I mean, that is South Carolina. Even with all these folk that are coming from Indiana and Ohio, it's the same type of voter. I mean, we don't have a new type of voter that's emerging in South Carolina. And she was a two-term governor. I mean, winning an election in 2014 and getting beat here in 2024, that is not that long ago. I mean, we're not talking about somebody who came in with no record.
Jay, it wasn't long ago that she was saying, I can't wait to get back to my sweet state of South Carolina.
It was the
not so sweet.
But one more point. I mean, she also abandoned Nevada, and she ran a good gubernatorial campaign for the past month during this primary cycle, but she just couldn't do it. So my point is, I don't think the future for Nikki Haley is bright when this happens in South Carolina.
But that also means the future for the Republican Party is not bright, and maybe the future for the country is not bright. You have a Republican Party now that has abandoned the border. This is what you're voting for now. When it comes to immigration, you scream fire year one, you spread the fire year two by sending immigrants all over the place. You stop the fire trucks, and then you try to run on immigration, and nobody is challenging that. You abandoned Ukraine. Here you have a military state, and you have Ukrainians losing cities, losing ground, and the only Republican in the country saying, for God's sake, do not abandon democracy. For God's sake, do not abandon Ukrainians to Putin's butchers, is Nikki Haley. And she just got destroyed in a military state.
Yeah.
That is not just bad for Nikki Haley's future and whatever. It's bad for the Republican Party and for the United States of America.
And also, to Jonah's point about the idea that there's going to be this kind of faction that rises up and, like, it can be a check on the party in the Congress. I mean, the primary election system and the way these districts are is built for the opposite.
Oh, I
It is
agree.
built to, like, take those people down one by one. I mean, look at Liz Cheney, right? She's like the prime example of that.
Why I want to get rid of the primaries.
Even if Donald Trump were to lose the election and the whole party have to resort itself, I just don't see how the party recovers from what it's become.
Adi said you thought people are up there because they want to be up there. I think people are up there because the reality of Republican politics today, they feel demands them being up there if they want to get reelected, if they want to be vice president. 100%. I mean, power has having been on both sides of this thing.
I get it, but there's a lot of House lawmakers who are headed for the exits. There's been people who have been spiritually excommunicated.
Right.
I do think we've witnessed a purge, and a lot of the people who are there are the people who want to be there.
But it is a fact
because they don't want to be purged.
It is a fact that someone like Tim Scott, with his eyes closed, alone at night, would admit that he would rather Nikki Haley be the GOP nominee than Donald Trump.
That is your judgment. I don't know what he's doing at night. I'm just saying.
But most elected Republicans, if they were being honest with themselves, would want Nikki Haley, but they know that the power mechanisms are behind Donald Trump, and their power and future hinges on that.
But you act like Donald Trump has the ability to just make these things happen independent of what the voters want. Tim Scott's constituents,
well, that's
his party in South Carolina, everybody that votes for him, and most of the people he encounters on a daily basis are saying, I really think we should do Trump again. So there is some aspect of politics here where these people have to respond to the people that they represent.
So wait, David, can I ask you a question about this? Because I just am having this, I'm wondering that if Trump himself goes away, the voters that are with him, right? Are they only with him?
Yes.
Are they not with the party? Because there was a little bit of this with Obama, right? There were a lot of people, voters in the country, who were with Obama, but they weren't going to be with any generic Democrat. Is the same thing going on here?
Well, look, I think that Trump is responding to things that he works the seams that he sees. He sees people anger. He sees people. He doesn't choose these issues because he's deeply contemplative about the problems facing America. He chooses those things that he thinks reflects the base that he can build, and he works at them, and he works at resentment, and he works at anger. Can someone else come along and do it as well as he? I think that's a questionable, but
I mean, we know
but
that
it
MAGA
is
voters don't turn out in other races where he's not on the ticket, right?
Right.
You know.
Let's go back to Jake in D.C.